Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the right and the good, Ross, about halfway into the chapter that you're looking at, says, the moral convictions of thoughtful and well-educated people are the data of ethics. The data means, the sort of starting points that we use to make sense out of things. And what does he mean? Well, think about when you handle data in other circumstances, other fields, other disciplines. The data is what you're observing, right? That's what it means literally. Data, that which is given, comes from the Latin word for giving. And it's what is given to you. When you go out and you gather data, you're looking for what's going on. Now, what would that be in moral life? What is the data of moral life? You guys have been gathering it for a long time, whether you realized it or not. Every time that you got into some sort of situation where it could go this way or it could go this way, and you asked yourself what's the right thing to do, and you consulted your feelings about it or some principles about it. Maybe you actually did the wrong thing, and then you realized it was the wrong thing later. That ever happened to you? It's happened to me a lot of times. Still does, every once in a while. What else? Adults telling you things along the way. Knock that off. When they say knock that off, and you feel that kind of twinge, or depending on how they phrased it to you, and what else it went along with. Maybe you actually got out of the room so you didn't get hit or anything like that. You were actually learning about moral life. Now you might have been mislearning things, right? If your parents had the might makes right philosophy, whatever I say goes. You're basically just here to satisfy my whims and needs because I'm the powerful one and you're not, in power. They probably screwed you up, right? You seen kids like that? Have you known adults like that? Still know any adults like that these days? Where you can look at them and you say, wow, that person had a terrible upbringing. Somebody really screwed that kid up, On the other hand, you guys recognize this, I think. When you would go to other people's houses and visit, did you ever compare them with your own? Yeah? How did it turn out? Favorably, unfavorably? Did you feel that your household was really squared away and the other people, they were getting it wrong? Or sometimes you say, man, I kind of like the way things go over there a bit better than the way things go here. And it's not just because, they got candy or got to play games or things like that, or people talked nice to each other, and didn't yell or things like that. It was probably in part, at least at some points, you're like, that dad actually helps out with homework. What's wrong with mine? Shouldn't he be helping me out with that or taking an interest in it? Or, pick whatever else you like. That mom, when she has to divide up good things between us kids, she doesn't play favorites. As a matter of fact, she even gives me an equal share, even though I'm just a guest. That would be actually learning about moral life. And Ross, so this is where Ross is beginning. And he thinks that the way in which we come to know these things is not so much by moral theories, which is what you guys have been studying, right, over the course of the semester. And it's more by looking at the way in which we actually do think and feel and act. Not just, everybody, because there's some people who are screwed up, and you don't want to consult them, right? If you think of anybody offhand who would make a terrible moral instructor? You know, maybe somebody in the news recently. Anybody come to mind? You guys watch TV, right? Or stuff on the internet, at least? Anything going on that, in the last 10 years, that you could say, wow, that person should not be in charge of kids in their moral development? Who would you pick for the prize for that? Yeah.
Sandusky?
Yeah. I mean, there'd be a glaring instance, right? And actually, he was in charge of kids. That's part of what made it so problematic. He like fooled people for years and years and years. That's why people felt betrayed. And some people actually felt that they had a duty to defend the guy. And then after a while, once more and more information started coming out, then they started thinking, maybe I shouldn't defend this guy. Maybe I should actually be criticizing him. Yeah, I mean, if you imagine growing up in a household where not only that sort of thing was going on, but it was being presented as if it was the norm, the way things ought to be. How screwed up would that make you? So you wouldn't actually want to consult that person's moral intuitions. Of thoughtful and well-educated people. So it's not just any Joe Blow on the street. It's going to be people who have actually given some thought to this. You look to people whose lives seem to be fairly well squared away, and Ross is willing to say you can't actually know who is and who isn't until you scratch the surface. But you look at those people and then you see where they are and what they have to think about these sort of things. And we'll come back to that in a moment. I want to touch on some of the other theories that he talks about. And he says, well, they're not doing this. So he talks about egoism, and he talks about hedonism and utilitarianism. And he thinks that each one of these, there's something wrong with it as a theory. It doesn't jibe with the way in which we actually think about what we ought to do, our duties, right? And so, as we go through this, think about whether this makes sense for you. What does egoism say you ought to do? What are your duties as an egoist?
Your self-interest.
Yeah. What did you say?
Like your self-interest, like make decisions with like your own benefit.
Yeah, very good. So you should consult your own self-interest or benefit and pay attention to that and say everybody else is going to forget about that and do whatever it takes to, say, maximize your satisfaction of your interests. And so he says, well, that can't be right. I mean, people do behave that way, right? We know some people who act that way. And we actually know some people who talk that way. Interestingly, sometimes the people who talk that way, you watch their lives, and you find out actually they're not egoists. They're helping people out on the side, which they shouldn't be doing, even when it doesn't benefit them. And he says, the theory comes to grief over the fact which stares us in the face. A great part of duty, great part of what we feel obliged to do, what we sense ourselves to have an obligation to do, consists in an observance of the rights and a furtherance of the interests of others. Now that could be compatible with being an egoist, right? You can be an egoist and you want to be nice to people so they're nice to you. But then he says, whatever the cost to ourselves may be. So when we feel ourselves under an obligation, this is how you can tell people who actually have a sense of obligation, those who don't. People who have a sense of obligation think that whatever the cost is to them, if they have an obligation to another person, they're supposed to do that. They may not fulfill it, but they at least have a sense that, hey, that's what I ought to be doing. So egoism doesn't really work. It doesn't really fit the way in which we tend to think about things in the real world. Even though there are a lot of people who act like egoists, they oftentimes recognize that they're doing the wrong thing. That's why they try to hide their actions. That's why they try to argue that they're actually good for everybody else. right? Hedonism and utilitarianism, his criticisms of these have to do with the issue of pleasure. Is pleasure the only good thing? So, think back to when we were talking about hedonism. I think for some of you, you had that aha moment where you said, yeah, this makes sense. Now I finally get it. Everything really is about pleasure and pain. Some of you said, yeah, but what about this? What about this? This doesn't seem to be reducible to pleasure and pain. And Ross says, unless we want to understand pleasure in a really, really attenuated sense, where it almost doesn't mean anything, is pleasure really the only good that we ought to be thinking about, the only thing that we seek? Or are there other things that we value? And he talks about two things. And then he talks about another one in another chapter. And he leaves out something that you guys have brought up a lot. Relationships. Are relationships just about pleasure for you, or do you see a value in at least some of your relationships that goes beyond the pleasure that you have in it? What do you think? What would you say? As soon as somebody stops being pleasurable or likely to be pleasurable in the future, you cut them off? Is that how you guys behave? I doubt it. There may be a few people who you said, this person is a pain, literally a pain, and I'm not going to hang around with them anymore. But those people are probably not that close to you, right? Who are people that are close to you that are sometimes a pain, and maybe at this point in your life you don't necessarily derive a lot of pleasure from, but you feel that your relationship is worth something? Hopefully not your boyfriend or girlfriend, or husband or wife, because that would be pretty awful, wouldn't it? But that could happen. I mean, if you make a commitment to somebody, and you say for better or for worse, and then things turn out for worse, they get horribly maimed and can't really do much with you, and your life with them is mostly just taking care of them, which is not a lot of fun. You'd still say it's important to do that, wouldn't you? Or if you're looking at somebody else in that situation, if they sort of say, see you later, no longer pleasurable for me, you would say there's something wrong with that action, that person, wouldn't you? Who in your life currently do you find to be kind of a pain? And maybe you wish things were different, but they're not. And you don't even know if they're going to be in the future. But yet you feel that your relationship is worth something. Family? Which family members? The crazy cousin who you only see once a year? Probably not. Who then?
Parents.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people find their parents to be a pain. But they say, hey, this is my mom, this is my dad. This is worth something. From a hedonist perspective, that doesn't make sense. Maybe brothers and sisters. If you have a screw-up brother or screw-up sister. Still your brother or sister, aren't they? Sometimes you even still love them, no matter what sort of things they do. And you can think about other cases like this as well. Utilitarianism is kind of a strange bird because it's saying everybody's pleasures have to be looked at equally, and that's kind of good because it gets us away from straight out egoism, he says. But again, is that all there is? Is pleasure? In addition to relationships, which Ross doesn't actually talk about in this thing, he says moral cultivation, what he calls virtue, character. That's worth something to you, isn't it? Isn't your character valuable to you? Isn't the character of your friends valuable to you? Don't you have some people who you're friends with because they're I don't know what the female equivalent would be for this, but we can think about that. What's the female equivalent of a stand-up guy? You guys all know that phrase, right? A stand-up guy, that's somebody who's loyal, who you can count on, who actually has good character. You can rely on them to do the right thing. You can trust your family with them. That's valuable, right? And that's not just about pleasure. But what else? Intellectual development. What you guys are engaged in. Now, you know, granted, a lot of this class is, you know, for you guys a means to an end, right? Graduation, we've talked about this many times. But some of the stuff that you guys are studying, when you have that moment where it clicks, you say, yeah, now this makes sense. And I know this from a lot of your papers. That's intellectual development. You've acquired something. You're at a higher level than you were before. And is that always pleasant? What do you think? Studying pleasant? How many of you like studying? I don't even like studying. I used to. I kind of lost the taste for it after a while. I do enjoy, you know, doing philosophy, but I don't necessarily sit down. I like sitting down and making myself, okay, now I have to read this and focus on this. But it pays off, doesn't it? Right? You have something that's yours that you can hold on to after that. So these don't really work. He talks about G. Moore's theory, but I'm going to skip over that as well. And then he talks about Kant, Kantian deontology. And you would say, well, you know, Ross is a deontologist, Kant's a deontologist. They should be on the same page, right? And they should be in complete agreement. What's the problem with Kant? Well, Kant, when he's talking about duty, he tries to reduce everything to one principle. He's got this thing called the categorical imperative, which we're going to look at in the near future. And Kant thinks that we're generally, you know, trying to reduce everything to what he calls perfect duties, duties that are completely obligatory upon us. And we can distinguish those from imperfect duties, which, you know, they're not optional, but they don't have the same sort of priority to them. So, for example, Kant would say you should never tell a lie. Never, ever, 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 ever. And we'll see why when we look at Kant and the categorical imperative. But are there situations in which you probably ought to tell a lie? I mean, the utilitarians would say, yeah, just look at, you know, what benefits the largest amount of people. If the killer is, you know, at the door of the nursery and says, I want to kill some babies, and, you know, you could tell him, hey, the maternity ward is on the other side of the hospital, and that'll give you enough time to call security. Is that a good lie to tell? What do you guys think? Yes? I'd tell it. And the utilitarian would tell it too. Kant would say, no, even though it's going to bring about bad consequences, you still shouldn't lie. Ross would say, you got to look at what your actual duties are. Some duties in particular cases are more stringent than other duties. It's not so simple as having one principle by which we can derive everything. So how do we actually get a sense of what our duties are, what we ought to do? He says, when a plain man fulfills a promise because he thinks he ought to, it seems clear that he does so with no thought of its total consequences. Most people, when they're, you know, carrying out moral reasoning, do they actually sit down and say, now how would every single stakeholder be affected by this? Do they fill out a worksheet similar to the one that I gave you for utilitarianism? Now, we might do something a little bit like that in some circumstances. Do we consult the categorical imperative? Do we think to ourselves, am I acting in such a way that the maximum of my action can be made into a universal law of nature that I can will? Probably not, right? There's something more basic than that. But because of the fact that it's more basic, it ends up being what we call pluralistic. There end up being, let me put that word up there. Pluralistic. When you see that word, what do you think you ought to think about? Plural means more than one. There's going to be more than one mode of obligation, more than one kind of thing that we ought to do. And so Ross is going to call these prima facie duties. And this is his main contribution to moral theory, the way that, you know, people look at him today. There's a lot more in his book, but this is probably the most important notion that he puts on the table. Now, this is the one that I think that a lot of you can relate to quite well. I know that you can because you're like other students, right? And other students tend to get this as well, in part because it makes good sense, because he's focusing on our ordinary moral conceptions. One of the other criticisms that Ross has in all of these that I want to, well, not necessarily of egoism, but of utilitarianism and Kantian deontology, is the fact that duties are personal. Duties are personal in nature. You have duties not just because you're a human being, and all human beings have duties, of a certain sort, but because you're that guy, you're that woman, you're, your father's daughter, your mother's son, down the line, right? You guys have duties to each other as classmates that didn't exist before you sat down in this classroom 10 weeks ago. Like he says, these theories tend to unduly simplify our relations to our fellows. They say, in effect, that the only morally significant relation in which neighbors stand to me is, being beneficiaries, or, other ways of putting it. And this relation of being a possible beneficiary of my action, that's important. But what else? He says, other human beings stand to me in the relation of promisee to promiser, people that you make promises to, of creditor to debitor, of wife to husband, of child to parent, of friend to friend, of fellow countryman to fellow countryman, and the like. And each of these relations, he says, is the foundation of a prima facie duty, which is more or less incumbent upon me according to the circumstances of the case. So the fact that you exist in this fabric of concrete relationships that are part of who you are, right? You're so-and-so's daughter, and she's not. And she's somebody else's daughter. And, you guys could be connected with each other, study partners or something like that, and that would create other obligations. Friends, you could become friends. I suppose your families could be connected by marriage in some fashion, but you're never going to have the same parents, right? You're never going to have the same duties to the same people. You can compare your duties to each other. I feel I've not been a good son because, I look at him and he's done so much more for his parents than I have, things I should have been doing. But those are still his parents. That's his duty. That's his relationship to them. Mine is to my own, right? And duties are intensely personal like this.